Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're at the top of the hour here, so thanks everyone for joining. Today we have a very interesting presentation by one of our members and one of our directors, David Lindwall. Before we get started, Michael, do you have any announcements for the society?
Well, it's really just one reminder, and that is that the new handbook is available. If you're outside the U.S., it's now really easy to buy, printed in nearby countries with low shipping. There are some sales, so people are buying them. I'm hearing some comments. That's about, oh, okay, there you go. You hold that up to you. That's great. Okay, that is volume 3.
Yeah,
it's a 3-volume set, and it would grace your bookshelves with any profits going to the society.
I ordered them on the Monday of the last meeting, and they arrived on the Thursday and Friday, and that's over in the UK. And I think they were printed over here as well, because it says printed in Great Britain on the inside.
It's fabulous that they could do that.
That was Amazon Prime. My son ordered them on. So
did you have to pay? So did you have to pay any shipping? You?
No.
Okay. That's it, Rich.
Okay, good. Now, let me find. Oh, well, where did Mr. Lindwall go?
I'm right here.
There. Oh, there he is. Okay. So, thanks everybody for joining, and I'm going to put the spotlight on David, if I can find this. There it is. Okay. So, spotlight for everybody. So, if I could ask everybody to please mute until the questions at the end. David, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Okay, let me put the slideshow here. Can everyone see the slide?
Yeah, and so middle top slideshow.
Middle. No, I can't see it from.
No, the top. Yeah, to the right, to a little bit in the middle of slideshow.
Here we go.
I can't see that. I'm just on audio.
David,
can you all see it now? Perfect.
Yep.
Okay. Back about a year ago, Michael invited a colleague of mine, Bill Mera, who's not a stamp collector, but who's someone who knows Guatemala's history very well, to talk about the history of the 1954 revolution. So many of you will have participated already in that presentation, and I will try not to repeat too much of the story, but rather to focus more on the philatelic aspects of it. There's probably no other period in Guatemalan history that is as well documented through stamps as the revolution of 1954. So what I would like to do today is kind of go through the stamps that illustrate this revolution. Most of you own all of these stamps because they're very reasonable. None of these are rare stamps, but you may not know the history behind them. And indeed, if you look through Guatemala number 2, there's just a very brief description of each of these stamps, none of which really make the connection to the revolution of 1954. So my attempt today is to try to help you understand some of the stamps that are in your collection and how they played a part in Guatemala's history. The picture you see here is of Jacobo Arbenz. He was the controversial president from 1951 until 1954, when he resigned under pressure from the Guatemalan military and under pressure from a paramilitary force that was building up in Honduras at the time, supported by the CIA. To go back to the revolution of 1954, you really have to look at Guatemalan history a little bit longer. After the separation from the Spaniards in 1821, the independence from Spain in 1821, Guatemala's had quite a number of palace coups, but there've really only been 3 revolutions in Guatemala's post-independence history. There was the revolution of 1871, which we've talked about in other presentations before. That's when Justo Rufino Barrios came into Guatemala City with his army to overthrow the conservatives that had ruled Guatemala off and on since independence. And with the liberal revolution, it wasn't just a change in the guy at the top, but Barrios brought in foreign investment. He brought in the railroads. He brought in commercial agriculture like coffee and sugar. He minimized the power of the church, almost eliminated the power of the church, confiscating many of their properties. So it really was a revolution in the genuine sense of the word. The October Revolution, which is celebrated in Guatemala today, interestingly enough, was to celebrate the removal of General Jorge Ubico. Ubico was freely and fairly elected in 1931, but he consolidated his power and managed to get himself reelected 2 more times in elections that were controversial, to say the least. He was when people look at his legacy today, there's some people who see him as a tyrant. There are others who see him as a modernizer. I'll leave it to Guatemalans to decide who Jorge Ubico really was. But after 13 years in power, there was a lot of pressure to remove him. In early July of 1944, there were a number of demonstrations, large demonstrations, started first by the teachers and then others joined in, which really weren't violent, but Jorge Ubico decided as a result of those to step down, which I think came as a surprise, certainly came as a surprise to the demonstrators, but I think it also came as a big surprise to all of his supporters. No one's really quite sure why he stepped down. It would seem like, after 13 years in power and ruling with an iron fist, that he wouldn't be intimidated by the crowds. Some say he may have already realized by then that he had terminal cancer, and that may have played a role. But in any event, he stepped down in July of 1944 and turned over power to his Minister of Defense. His Minister of Defense wasn't much different from him. And so the pressure to remove him became really great. And by October 20th of 1944, dissident military officers overthrew the military officer who had succeeded Ubico. And so that's known as the October Revolution. And it's still celebrated today. Today is a holiday in Guatemala City. There will be large parades to celebrate the restoration of democracy and the removal of Ubico and his successor, Ponce Vaide. The stamps that you see here, unfortunately, the pictures, our pictures, as interesting as they are covering up some of the stamps, but you can get a sense of what these are. These are all stamps that I'm sure all of you have in your collection, and they celebrate
the number, the catalog number, the one you're talking about. I can't see the.
So the catalog numbers for these stamps, the regular stamps are Scott 313.
Oh, okay.
And the airmail stamps here are, let me pull those up. So the souvenir sheet is C136 and C135 is one of the stamps. So these are, these are common stamps that I suspect are in all of your collections, but you may not know that they celebrate an event for Guatemala that remains celebrated today, and that's the October Revolution. The October Revolution brought in a number of military officers who really did want to reform Guatemala. In 1944, Guatemala was quite a feudal society. The Indians and the peasants really didn't have very much influence. They were desperately poor. There were very few government services. And so the 1944 revolution was largely built around the idea of equalizing Guatemalans and bringing the disenfranchised masses, which really were a huge percentage of the population, into the political life of the country. And the leader of that movement wound up being Juan José Arévalo. At the time of he was not involved in the revolution, I should say. Arévalo was an academic. At the time of the revolution, he was teaching at the University of Tucumán in Argentina. And he was recruited by 3 or 4 of the different political parties that emerged from the October Revolution to run for president. And he won overwhelmingly. There was very little competition. And so he won the election in 1945 and ruled the country from 1945 until 1951. The stamp you see over on the side is Scott 701. It was issued in 2014. It's the only stamp that commemorates the period that we're talking about, 1944 to 1954. There just weren't, after 1954, it was not politically correct to look back on this period, the Arévalo years and his reforms, as something positive. There was a lot of fear, certainly after 1954, that Arévalo's association with communist advisors, many of which were brought in from abroad, tainted his legacy. And so this is at a time, you can imagine 1945, when there was a lot, when the Cold War was just getting started, and people all around the world, certainly in the United States, but also in Guatemala, were worried about the influence of communists and the possibility that more countries could fall under the Iron Curtain. And Arévalo was not a communist. In fact, Arévalo, when Ubico ran for president in 1931, Arévalo was his chief propagandist. He produced I guess we'd call him a social media advisor in those years. He produced a slick weekly publication that was given out for free in Guatemala that was largely the publication that supported Ubico's election. And once Ubico won, he made Arévalo the equivalent of what we would call in the United States the Assistant Secretary of Education. So Arévalo, while he may have been a reformer as a president, certainly in his past, he was close to the powers to be. But he left Guatemala, went to Argentina to teach, was recruited to come back to run as president, and he was a real reformer. Though it wasn't until 2014 that Guatemala finally honored him with a stamp. During one of his biggest reforms was labor rights. There had been no labor rights under Ubico. And so Guatemala passed a labor reform law on the 1st of May of 1947. And so these stamps that, again, all of you have in your collections commemorate this really historic event in Guatemala. And it turned out to be one of the pieces that undid all of the reforms, but at least at the moment of the reform, it was a huge success in Guatemala. The other big reforms that Arévalo passed, perhaps the one that's most meaningful to Guatemalans today, was the creation of the Social Security Institute. Before Arévalo, there was if somebody got sick, there were very few public hospitals, and those that were so oversubscribed that most people really had no access to medical care. And there also was no retirement scheme. And so his creation of the Social Security Institute, though honestly it only involved urban workers, and only a small percentage of them for the first years of the Arévalo administration, at least was a beginning that today is very important in Guatemala. Almost all employees now are members of the Social Security Institute, pay into it, and that assures them a retirement, but it also assures them treatment at the Social Security Hospital, which is one of the better public hospitals in Guatemala. Arévalo also began the process of land reform, though Arbenz, we'll later see, was better known for land reform. But Arévalo took the properties that had been taken from the Germans and started distributing them to the peasants. In the process, he also distributed quite a number of them to his supporters and to members of his government. Arbenz, who later became president, wound up through land reform getting the largest cotton plantation in Guatemala. So there are some privileges, I guess, of government. But the reforms of the October Revolution were genuine. And it was a beginning of a process that didn't stop even in 1954 when Arbenz was overthrown. One of the more controversial period or incidents in the presidency of Arevalo was the Central American and Caribbean Games of 1950. By then, he had been in power for 4 years, and the tension with the United States was growing. In part, the tension was related to all the labor problems that the American companies in Guatemala started having. But in part, it was also the fear that communist advisors around Arevalo could take the government or could take Guatemala in a direction which could prove ultimately to become an existential threat to the United States. When I mentioned communist advisors, he had people like Torriello, who came in from Mexico to be the labor advisor. He had 2 communists come up from Chile to run the education ministry. He had communists from Spain who had fled the Franco government, put them in a number of government positions like Social Security, over the orphanage, and over a number of other institutions. So while he was not a communist, and not everyone in his government certainly were communists, there were enough recognized international communists in his government that Washington was worried where Guatemala was going. So what does that have to do with the Central American Games and Scott C-171 to C-176? So these sports stamps, which are some of Guatemala's most popular stamps, were issued to commemorate those games. And Puerto Rico, as part of the Caribbean, was invited to participate. And since Puerto Rico was part of the United States, the American ambassador, who at the time was named Richard Patterson, was invited to sit in on the games. But much to his horror, when the Puerto Rican team marched in front of the stands, they had a flag. They didn't have the stars and stripes. They had the flag with Puerto Rico's shield on it. And instead of playing the U.S. national anthem, they played a Puerto Rico song called La Borinqueña. This really upset Ambassador Patterson, who stormed out of the games and filed an official protest, which was really just the end of a whole bunch of protests that he had filed over the years. There was a lot of bad blood that had built up between the United States and Patterson as the representative and the Arevalo government. As a result of that, Arevalo had his ambassador in Washington go into the State Department and say that Guatemala could not ensure the safety of Ambassador Patterson. And in diplomatic speak, that's actually a threat. So Washington immediately removed Patterson, but it raised the level of tension between Washington and Guatemala, certainly with the Arevalo government, one more niche. And Washington, in the end, wound up sending to replace Patterson a guy who was well known for overthrowing government in Greece. So the departure of Patterson may have satisfied Arevalo, but in the end, it didn't help the Guatemalan cause. So those stamps, we just look at them as interesting sports stamps, some of Guatemala's more beautiful crafted sports stamps, but in fact, they have a whole history of confrontation between Guatemala and the United States. In November of 1950, there was an election, the first time in many, many years. Some people say the first time ever. I think going back through the history of Guatemala, we find several democratically elected governments. And so I'm hesitant to join those who say it's the first time ever. But in any event, there was a peaceful electoral transition of power. And that certainly hadn't happened in a very long time. And so the election of November 1950, it was disputed. The primary candidates were Jacobo Arbenz, who was the Minister of Defense, and General Francisco Arana, who was the head of he was like the head of the Joint Chiefs. Suspiciously enough, just before the elections, Arana was murdered by Arbenz's chief of staff. So the primary contender in the election was eliminated. The 2 other major contenders were General Miguel Yediras Fuentes, who was chased out of country. He had to go to El Salvador in exile. And Jorge Garcia Granados, who was put in jail. So today, people, academics certainly talk about this as being a free and fair election. But it was only free and fair after they had eliminated the three primary contenders and left only Arbenz. So Arbenz won overwhelmingly, needless to say, and he assumed the presidential powers in March of 1951. Here you see stamps that were issued in 1953. This is Scott 332. No, I'm sorry. It's Scott C-185 to 87, which talk about presidential succession and democracy, and it shows the term of the new president, 1951 to 1957. And you would say, why did Guatemala need to issue stamps saying they had a functioning democracy and a freely elected president under the Constitution? You see the Constitution there under the Guatemalan flag. And the reason for that was because his presidential succession was quite controversial. Not only was the election itself controversial, but the murder of Francisco Arana was viewed by many as kind of the original sin that poisoned the Arbenz administration, and it never really quite recovered from that. And so these stamps, which were printed by the Austrian state printing company, were designed as sort of a propaganda tool to show that no, he was really legitimate, and that that he was the constitutional successor of Arevalo. Interesting enough, these stamps were issued just about the time that there was a rebellion against the Arbenz government, and former military people took over the town of Salama. It was about, maybe 200 rebels took it. They only held it for about a day. They were hoping that Guatemalans would rally to their support, but nobody did. So in the end, most of them were arrested. A few were killed. Many of them languished in jail until the very end of the Arbenz administration. But that happened concurrently with the release of these stamps. So one of the big bones of contention that Arbenz had to deal with, after Arevalo had already taken care of some of the big reforms that needed to be done, the biggest challenge that Arbenz had was how to control the power of the multinational corporations that really ran everything in Guatemala and had a huge impact on Guatemala's economy. Bananas, as you see here, represented in Scott 332 of 1950 and 344 of 1953. Bananas were a major Guatemalan export, but they were all exported by the United States, the Boston-based United Fruit Company. And because they were such a huge economic power in the country, they also had a lot of political power. They bribed presidents to get lower tax rates. They had a monopoly over the railroad system in the country. They owned and ran the only international telegraph system for Guatemala. So United Fruit Company had a lot of power. And here these stamps show the importance of bananas to Guatemala's economy. And they were both issued, the first one under Arevalo and the second one under Arbenz, to show the Guatemalan people this was part of the public patrimony of Guatemala that needed to be recovered, and that this continued to be a priority of the Guatemalan government. At the time, they called the United Fruit Company El Pulpo, which means the octopus, because it had its influence in just about every corner of Guatemala's economic and political life. And these stamps, while they're not commemorative stamps, they do show the importance that bananas played not only in Guatemala's economy, but ultimately in the revolution of 1954. Here is a letter, and many of you probably have letters from that period. They're actually quite common. This is one from the private secretary of the president. So this is Arbenz's private secretary writing Mr. William Castor, who was a political operative, actually one of the most important political operatives in the Philadelphia area. And who knows what was in the letter? It's clearly very official. It's got stamps. It's got an official cancel. But it was sent on July 29th, it looks like here, which was only 2 weeks after the Arbenz government started distributing land that they had confiscated from the United Fruit Company, and also only about 2 weeks or about 12 days after the Arbenz government had expropriated the electric company, which belonged to another American corporation. So there were a number of confiscations. One I haven't written here because I'm not sure of the date. About this same time, they also confiscated the port of San Jose, which was owned and run at that time by an American company. So there was a lot going on in the days before this cover was mailed, and all I can imagine is that it must have contained a response to why it was that Guatemala was confiscating properties that were owned Americans. But official correspondence from that period is, say, it's fairly common, and I'm sure many of you have covers which relate to this particular period in Guatemalan history. One of the more enigmatic series of stamps that were printed related to the Revolution of 1954 is this series of stamps, which were issued October 13, 1954. So October 13, 1954 is after the fall of the Arbenz government. But when you look at these stamps, you see that they were made to commemorate the meeting of foreign ministers of Central America on October 14th, 1951. And what the foreign ministers did in that particular meeting was sign an agreement in which all of the 5 countries of Central America would collaborate on all kinds of issues, anything from trade to, it wasn't a trade agreement per se, but it did have a mechanism in it to resolve trade disputes. But it also had security guarantees. It had elements related to disaster relief and all kinds of other areas where the countries wanted to collaborate with each other. So why, if that happened in 1951, was this stamp not issued until October of 1954? Guatemala number 2 does not offer a suggestion for it, but I will offer a suggestion for it. So while it was created in 1951, in 1953, Guatemala was supposed to host the foreign ministers in Guatemala City to go over their next sort of agenda items. But by 1953, there was already a lot of worry, certainly in Nicaragua and El Salvador, that the Guatemalan government was under the influence of communists. And so Salvador and Nicaragua had conspired with Honduras and Costa Rica to raise a point where all of the Central American governments would promise to defend each other against communism. Well, of course, Arbenz saw that as a direct attack on him and his government. So he canceled the meeting, and the meeting was never held. And Guatemala then subsequently in April of 1953 withdrew from ODECA. So my guess about these stamps, and I may be wrong, is that they were ordered by the Arbenz government to show this big accomplishment of theirs in drawing Central America together to collaborate on a full range of issues, only to have the stamps sit in the vault after Guatemala decided to withdraw from ODECA, and ODECA ceased to be of interest to Guatemala. So my guess is these stamps, which commemorate the forming of ODECA in 1951, probably were ordered and arrived in Guatemala and then were not put on sale until after the Arbenz government fell. When the new government came in June of 1954, it probably found these stamps in the vault. And since the new government strongly supported ODECA, they issued them. So that's just my guess, but it doesn't make an awful lot of sense that these stamps would commemorate something in 1951 and only be issued in October of 1954. The other thing is that these were printed again by the Austrian printing company. And since the Armas government didn't come in until June of 1954, there's very little way they could have ordered these stamps and had them delivered by October of 1954. So almost certainly these stamps were already in the vault, and they just weren't issued because of the disagreements between Arbenz and his neighbors. So some of you will recall that during this same period, there was a lot of persecution of the Catholic Church in Eastern Europe. So in Poland, you had the arrest of Cardinal Stephen Wyszynski. In Hungary, you had the arrest of Cardinal Joseph Migzenti. These were two prelates who were real symbols of the Cold War. And even as the Catholic Church was being persecuted in Poland and Hungary, there was a lot of fear in the Catholic Church in Guatemala that it would also be persecuted if the Arbenz government were allowed to continue. So in 1953, the bishop, who unfortunately the stamp with his picture is covered up by our own pictures on this screen. But for those of you who have Scott CB 11 through 14, you will recognize these stamps. And CB 14, which we can't really see in this picture, depicts Archbishop Roseli Arellano. And he was a very strong anti-communist. He clearly knew the story of Catholics in Poland and Hungary under the communists. And he felt compelled to come out and rouse Guatemalan Catholics against the possibility of a communist government. And so he went around starting in January of 1953, but he went on for almost a year. He took a bronze copy of the Christ of Esquipulas. The Christ of Esquipulas is the leading shrine in Guatemala, Catholic shrine in Guatemala. And so he took a bronze copy of that around Guatemala to the major towns, and he preached these sermons out in public squares in which he called on Guatemala to avoid godless communism. Finally, in April of 1954, when he thought that it was sort of the do or die, but either the communists or the anti-communists were going to triumph, he issued a pastoral letter in which he called on all Guatemalans to resist communism. Now, he never made references to the Arbenz government, so it wasn't that he was publicly accusing the Arbenz government of being anti-Catholic, but that was clearly the message that he was saying. So while avoiding, throwing a stone at the government, he made it clear to Guatemala's overwhelmingly Catholic population that if they didn't oppose the government, they were going to be stuck with godless communism. So these stamps were actually printed after, you see here, June 1957. They were printed after the fall of the Arbenz government for really two reasons. One is to thank Roseli Arellano for his activism in support of removing Arbenz. But the other message here, you see that it says that the stamps are to raise money to build a highway to Esquipulas. What isn't really said here is that the highway to Esquipulas was also the highway to the Atlantic coast. And one of the demands of Arbenz had been to build a highway to the Atlantic coast to break the monopoly that the United Company had through its railway. And so Armas, who succeeded Arbenz, wanted to show through these stamps that he was accomplishing what Arbenz was not able to accomplish, and that is to break the monopoly of the United Fruit Company over transportation between the Atlantic coast and Guatemala City. So this particular set of stamps has a lot of historical importance for the 1954 revolution. Again, unfortunately, our pictures are covering up part of this screen, but one of you, and all of you probably have covers that have bisects. This one, you can't really see it, but it's the cycle bisect. And, between 1950 and 1954, there was just a whole proliferation of bisects, mainly from on letters originating from outside Guatemala City. And the reason for this is the government just didn't have an awful lot of money, so it wasn't printing a lot of new stamps. And it also didn't have a great deal of interest in providing new stamps to all of the post offices around the country. So the post offices around the country had a real deficit of stamps and wind up having to cut up stamps in order to make the rates work. And that was tolerated both in Guatemala, but also you see as in this cover, it was accepted in the United States. And so the period from 1950 to 1954, many of you will have bisects that were just simply created because the Arbenz government didn't make a priority of supplying new stamps to the rural post offices. In June of 1954, the rebels who were based in Honduras, you see a picture of them over here in the corner, were creating a war of what they call the War of Liberation. And this group, as Bill Mera told us about a year ago, was organized, financed, trained by the CIA. And the head of it for the Guatemalans was a former colonel named Carlos Castillo Armas. He had been a colonel in the army who, when Francisco Arana was shot, had decided to lead a rebel movement in Guatemala. He was arrested, put in jail. He managed to escape the jail in what many call similar to the Count of Montecristo, which is one of these incredible stories. Went across to Honduras. Eventually, he convinced the CIA to back him, and he started putting together this ragtag army. As you can see from the picture on the left, these were mostly peasants. These were people who probably had no military experience before. There wasn't a very large number of them. There were only maybe 400. And in the end, the invasion of what they were terming the War of Liberation really didn't have a huge effect. What it did do is it convinced the Guatemalan army that the United States wasn't going to stop until Arbenz was gone. So the stamps that you see here commemorate actually the army that overthrew Ubico and Ponce Valle, his successor. So these stamps were issued to tell the Guatemalan army that they were appreciated by Arbenz. Arbenz knew that the Guatemalan army was suspicious of communists and only supported him because they supported constitutional order. They weren't really happy with Arbenz. And so this series of stamps, which honors the Army of 1944, was really a way of telling the Army that they were a valued member of Arbenz's government. This, of course, came a bit too late because by the time these stamps were issued, there was already movement across the border, and the Guatemalan army at that point really had become hard to convince that they should stand up and support Arbenz. So Arbenz government falls in late June of 1954, when the Liberation Army had just crossed the border. Arbenz was convinced, or the army was convinced again, that the United States was not going to back down. They went to Arbenz, told him he needed to either throw the communists out of his cabinet or he needed to resign. And he ultimately resigned and went into hiding at the Mexican ambassador's residence. So Carlos Castillo Armas moved into the country, managed with, just a small group of soldiers. The Guatemalan army decided not to fight against them. And so they marched on Guatemala City, and Carlos Castillo Armas formed a new government. They issued two series of stamps, one that was for regular mail and one that was for airmail. Both, certainly the airmail series is very popular today, and you can't see it in this picture, but the high value, the 5 quetzal stamp, pictures Carlos Castillo Armas, who was really the victor. He was the one who was able to convince the United States to support his revolution and to put him in power. There were a number of other contenders for power, so Washington had to sort of pick between the contenders. And there's a lot of question as to whether Carlos Castillo Armas was the right choice. But in the end, they had to pick someone. And so that's what this series of stamps commemorates. The 2 cent, you see the dagger, that's the symbol of the Liberation Army. The 4 cent, it shows, that the new government supports the family. The 5 cent shows the liberation dagger destroying the communist symbols. At the very bottom, you see Guatemala being welcomed again into the consort of Latin American nations at the Organization of American States. Several of the stamps show symbols of progress. So it was really a propaganda series to say, we won this war and this 1954 revolution is going to have a good outcome for Guatemalans. It did have a good outcome for many Guatemalans, but not for all Guatemalans. On July 26, 1957, President Carlos Castillo Armas was murdered by one of his bodyguards. There's still a whole question of, his bodyguard then supposedly committed suicide. So nobody's really quite sure what happened to Carlos Castillo Armas, but he was shot when he was going in a tunnel between the presidential house and the presidential palace, which was the office building for the presidency. His wife was with him at the time, and nothing happened to her. But it's never been totally clear why somebody would have killed Carlos Castillo Armas. There is a relatively new, it's about 3 years old now, novel by Vargas Llosa, the Peruvian author, called Tiempos Recios. I'm not sure what it's called in English, but it's a novel set around the murder of Carlos Castillo Armas and comes up with all kinds of conspiracy theories. But his murder was kind of the culmination of the 1954 revolution. And Guatemala issued a series of stamps, C-210 to 218, to honor him and to sort of close this chapter of Guatemalan history. You see here, again, this picture is not terribly clear, but on the very far right, you see Arbenz, the president who was overthrown in the 1954 revolution, sitting next to Che Guevara in Cuba. So the Cubans recruited Arbenz to come to Cuba and do radio programs that they sent into Guatemala calling for revolution in Guatemala. He quickly realized that the Cubans didn't really have an awful lot of interest in him, and so he and his family only stayed in Cuba about 1.5 years. But for a while, he was there connecting with the Cuban government, and this photograph is probably one of the biggest testimonies to that. So if you want to read more about this particular period in history, there's a new book out on it, A Confederacy of Fear, The Role of Congress and the American Media in the Fall of Jacobo Arbenz, written by one of the chief scholars, modern scholars of Guatemalan history, and it's available on Amazon. And so with that, let me pass it on to questions.
Excellent presentation, David, and I do want to tell everybody else that the book is really good.
Thank you.
It's an excellent book. Yeah, I was going to share one thing that I had mentioned to you before, David, if I can.
Please
take the screen sharing, if I can do that. And okay, can everybody see my screen now?
Yes.
Yeah, this is an interesting cover from 1938. Fairly innocuous looking cover. What's interesting about this is the return address is Horacio Córdoba y Monzón, who in the between 1950 and 1953, he was a reporter, and he had a radio show between 50 and 53 called the Anti-Communist Hour. And he would get on the radio and rail against the communists during the time of Arbenz, and which ruffled a lot of feathers in the Arbenz government. And in January of 54, Horacio was, so this is 6 months before Arbenz was overthrown. Horacio was picked up by the secret police, by the civil guard. He was taken to a prison in Guatemala City where he was tortured for several days. And then he was driven to the Mexican border with another fellow, Davila Cordoba. And the two of them were literally dumped on the other side of the border into Mexico, half dead. They had been, they used electroshock. They used other forms of torture, and they were in bad shape physically, and they were told never to come back to Guatemala. And this was sent from the offices where he worked as a reporter in the late 30s. So just kind of an interesting cover to compliment David, what you had on there.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah,
Okay.
just to add one very small bit to the series on the road to Esquipulas.
Yes.
Some of the most beautiful essays I've ever seen are of that set. They're truly works of art.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Other questions? David, I will add that you mentioned the domination of the United Fruit Company and the some of the other American companies. I think a lot of that domination came about because the Germans, had basically been expelled in 42 and 43, and they had dominated the economy before. So their domination of the Guatemalan economy was taken over by American domination of the Guatemalan economy.
Yeah, no, that's true. And in fact, one of the things that people often point out is that bananas in 1954, when the revolution took place, bananas represented less than 10% of the export earnings from coffee. So it's not like it was, the largest sector of Guatemala's economy. I think the reason why there was a lot of focus on the United Fruit Company, the American Electric Company, the ports, and other American investment was that German investment was pretty divided among like 100 or 200 families, who all had coffee plantations or had, other, sort of economic endeavors of their own. Whereas the United Fruit Company was this massive, massive company that had, hundreds of millions of dollars, which in those years was a fortune, in investment in Guatemala. And the United Fruit Company could kind of throw that around to influence politics in ways that even the Dieseldorfs, with all of their plantations, really didn't have anything comparable. There was no, in the German investment, it was all just so disaggregated. Was the German investment greater than the American investment? Probably so. Certainly their participation in exports was greater, but it was very disaggregated and consequently had less influence on politics.
Okay. Other questions for David?
Just a comment. That was a fabulous presentation. I learned so much about that period of time. Thank you.
No, I hope every time you look at those stamps now, you'll realize the intrigue, that went behind so many of them.
Oh, I also wanted to, at the beginning of your presentation, David, you mentioned the overthrow of or the resignation of Ubico. One of the events I read about recently was a school teacher. When the teachers were demonstrating, there was a young, I think she was somewhere around 28 or 30 years old, who was shot in the head during a peaceful, unarmed protest. And she became a symbol of the resistance against Ubico. And they still celebrated a day for her to commemorate her assassination. But it was right in downtown in Zona Uno, and she was in front of the I think it was the San Francisco Cathedral. They had just finished the march, and someone opened fire on the demonstrators, and she was a very beloved school teacher, and was shot in the head, and that really riled a lot of ordinary citizens.
Yeah.
Other thoughts or comments for Mr. Linwall?
Hey, David. I worked at Tropical Radio and Telegraph for a number of years. At the end of when WorldCom actually bought them out, and so I was part of the group that started to dispose of their files and file cabinets full of stuff. And I kept a couple United Fruit Company annual reports and some of their literature about telegraphs going into Guatemala. So I can scan that and share that with you if you'd like it.
I'd love to see that. And Tropical Radio and Telegraph was really was the only direct international communication from Guatemala from like 1915 until 1954. So it played a huge role in Guatemala's connection to the world. But again, that was something that was much resented by Guatemalans, that everything they did had to go through this foreign company. But yeah, I'd love to see that. Any of that documentation would be fascinating to me.
Yeah. My father-in-law, who's Guatemalan, his father actually worked for TRT also back in the 30s. So It was funny. So his son-in-law worked at the US version, and his father actually worked at TRT during, in the 30s. So that was kind of a weird combination we figured out, because I showed him one of my notepads, and he goes, "I've seen that logo before." And he went dug through it, and we connected the two historical dots. So I'll scan that stuff and send it to you.
I love that. Thank you.
Okay. Other comments for David?
David, do we know at this time does UFC still run the show down there?
No. So what happened was that right after, like the day after the fall of Arbenz, the Justice Department filed an antitrust suit against United Fruit Company. And I think they had been intending to do it for maybe a decade and had held off because of the tensions in Guatemala. And ultimately, United Fruit Company played a role at this point, not totally well defined, in the overthrow of Arbenz. But after that suit was filed, United Fruit was never the same. So it was bought out, or it became Chiquita. And they, under the terms of the suit, they had to compete with Dole and all kinds of other people. Ultimately, Chiquita decided that they didn't want to run any plantations in Guatemala. All they wanted was to buy the fruit from Guatemalans. So the government of Guatemala bought out Chiquita's plantations under a company named Bandegua. But Bandegua is a Guatemalan government entity that basically owns all of the plantations where Chiquita bananas are planted in Guatemala. So Chiquita, United Fruit Company, which became Chiquita, got out of the business of owning land and paying workers, and instead just buys the fruit from local producers. Now, they play a big role in training. They play a big role in pest prevention. So they're more than just buyers, but in the end, they no longer own the plantations or hire the workers.
Also, when United Fruit was put under investigation, the owner and CEO became so despondent over it. As I recall, he committed suicide by throwing himself from the top of a skyscraper in New York City.
Yeah.
David, what's the name of your book?
It's called A Confederacy of Fear: The Role of the United States Congress and Media in the Fall of Jacobo Arbenz.
And that's on Amazon?
It's on Amazon. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep, great book. Okay, other questions for David? Okay, well, next month's stamp chat will be the Waterloo octagonal date stamps.